Welcome to Radio Tipping Point. Mike Boyle pretending to be at the controls, and that was quite interesting before. Got started right now. Sitting here in the studio. Station's rather vacant. And I noticed that I was a little bit nervous. Now, I've been doing this for a while, and you would think that there would be some sort of routine that takes place here. And so I would walk into the studio, do whatever I plan to do, and then, of course, close up shop. But it doesn't necessarily work that way, especially if the idea is to take a bit of a risk. And so I realized this was a chance for me to reflect that what I try to do is risk it a little bit more, if possible, every week. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. But that's really what it's all about. To what degree do we feel that we have something at stake here, that we're either talking about something that we are in full conviction, or maybe we're not quite sure. So this is another one. I'm fully convicted, but not quite sure, if that makes sense. And our subject today is called A Commons Tragedy with a Dostoyevsky Beat. And for those of you who perhaps have heard this comment before, commons tragedy, it's basically a take of a concept that's been around for a while. It's called the tragedy of the commons. And in research for this program, I realized that the concept has been around much longer than I actually realized. It was actually formed in 1833 by a gentleman by the name of William Foster Lloyd. And of course, the popularization came from Garrett Hardin in 1968. Let me go ahead and describe to you what the basic tenet of the tragedy of the commons is. And certainly the one that's quoted quite often. Hardin describes a pasture that is open for all for grazing. And if we believe in those things, those elements that are in the common good, those things that belong to all of us, then we would argue that the grass should be for everybody. So we have the cattle out there on the pasture grazing. But of course, that cattle does not meander to the pasture on its own. No. They have, let's call them herdspersons. I don't know if that is the actual phraseology today, but it's good enough for a Tuesday morning. And of course, each individual is looking to maximize their gain in a term that we call utility. Utility is another fancy way of maximizing whatever that is to be actually obtained from whatever you're trying to do. maximizing utility. But of course, the pasture that we're talking about is finite. There's only so much grass. The area has a certain size. And this idea of the pursuit of utility ends up becoming counterproductive, meaning that the more the cattle continue to graze in that pasture, that a certain dynamic takes place, and basically the pasture ends up becoming ruined. It becomes overgrazed. At the end of this process, it becomes useless to all. It was very interesting going through what Hardin actually wrote, because he's quoted quite often. And the basic tenet of what Hardin was writing about was focusing on overpopulation, in that we need to consciously scale back the number of human beings that are being produced for this planet, and which I thought was quite interesting. Of course, it is a subject that we talk about often enough, although where I'm broadcasting this show from, in beautiful downtown Vienna, the problem isn't overproduction, but rather underproduction. So we can look at this as being a pendulum going back and forth. Back to Hardin. And this tragedy that he refers to basically leads us to two specific problems. One being the overuse, that because everybody's afraid that the other person is going to get more, then there's a rush for everybody to get out there to the pasture and get their cattle out there before it's too late. And then, of course, there's the other problem, that being the under-provision, meaning that the pasture becomes less and less through time because nobody has an incentive to really take care of it. And that's more or less built into the model. For those of you who have been following the news, know that we just closed up COP26 in Glasgow, either on Friday or Saturday, I'm not quite sure. Let's say it's Saturday, where a number of people were not satisfied. And I think this idea of the tragedy of the commons is quite accurate to describe our current malaise. Because whether we're talking about the household, or the neighborhood, or the city, or the country, or the region, or the planet, there's one rule that always comes into play, and that is what we call the economic rational choice theory, which basically infers that nobody is going to pay for something that they don't have to. And so we saw in Glasgow quite a bit of maneuvering taking place that mirrors very eerily the situation that Hardin describes in that pasture, where overuse obviously takes place because everybody's afraid that they will get there too late. and nobody wants to pay for the provisioning. And for those of you who are familiar with the concept of game theory, you could see that we have a game taking place because for those that can profit by doing nothing, taking advantage of the efforts of the group, eventually it leads us to a certain problem, and that would mean that the group loses their incentive to actually go ahead and produce. So looking at it from a personal level, can you imagine if you are the one who is producing and you feel that there are others that are not contributing, then after a while you are going to question, why do you bother producing? Have you been put on this planet to take care of the others? And that is a natural feeling. And the condition that we're describing here is very often called free riding. And so I'll go more into detail on this concept of free riding later on the show. But that will be one of the major focuses for today. Obviously, this problem that I'm describing is not something that just appeared out of the blue. We've had it for a number of years. And we can go back to some of the concepts that John Locke put together in the definition of private property that is 350 years old. And the idea, of course, is if we cannot go ahead and control those things that we consider to be belonging to all of us, aka the common good, then private property has to be the only solution. But of course, we know exactly what that attitude is, where it's taken us. That we feel that we can sell the resources, those resources that really do belong to all of us. We sell them to organizations or individuals, and we feel that, look, all of that of what we get for selling those resources, the state coffers are looking good. And those individuals who are responsible for actually going ahead and making that transaction, they'll go ahead like a proud peacock looking to show everybody what they've done for the populace. And then the real tragedy hits, folks. Because once we sell our resources, what we've noticed is that those individuals or organizations, let's call them companies, let's be direct about it. Those companies believe that they can do whatever they wish, because after all, they bought it. It belongs to them. So in essence, those things that we could and should look at as being part of the common good, those things that belong to all of us, all of a sudden we've changed the ground rules. And now the companies see that as being theirs. And of course, if you see it as being yours, then you feel that you could do whatever you want. And they have. And they do. And of course, we know that it doesn't end there, because we're referring to components of nature that cannot be so easily looked upon in isolation. And of course, it's led us to this mess tied to CO2. Not that CO2 is a mess, because certainly not, but in the way that's being used. Well, I don't need to go into that, do I? Adam Smith, when he put together the concept of wealth of nations, and this was back in 1776, he believed that the individual who is focused on her own profit or the incentive inevitably is focusing on the collective. In other words, that we have this balancing system within our head, which basically states, if I take too much, then the others will suffer, and in fact, I will suffer through that. But as we know, that was more wishful thinking from Mr. Adam Smith than anything else. And of course, going back to the tragedy of the commons, we know that balance, the balance that Adam Smith was referring to, is only really achievable if we have those necessary structures in place, rules that we all adhere to, hopefully all agree upon, which makes it a little bit easier. And those structures can either be visible or invisible. I'd like you to follow me within this idea, the frame of this conversation that I'd like to continue with today. If we agree that the root cause of both our ecological and social malaise, that it could be traced back to this concept of common good, or making sure that we are properly in tune with the common good, and that the common good is our most prominent axiom, those rules that we abide by, those things that we should always set as priority 1, 2, and 3. Then there are certain conditions that we need to set to make sure that's really fully ingrained in the thinking of everyone within our society. And first one would be that everyone feels that it belongs to all of us. So in other words, I think we would agree that the air that we breathe, that cannot be sold, or please feel free to contradict me there. In some countries, we believe that water is something that we sell. Certainly land is clearly something that we believe that can be sold, that an individual or a group can buy the land and can do whatever they want with it. And we know of the problems that has caused us. So let's wipe all of that away for the time being, and let's assume that we have a world where we identify all of these elements as being common property. In other words, they are elements that belong to all of us. So once we go ahead and establish that, then it makes it much easier for us to go ahead and say that because it belongs to all of us, we collectively hold the responsibility to make sure that we reach that balance, the balance that is not achievable within that tragedy of the commons. And inevitably, we would like to have a situation where value, whatever we define value to be, and well, certainly in this particular case, I would argue that value can be generated by one individual, but it's always looking at what that common goal will be. So the value I create vis-a-vis what is the collective. And for those of you who have been following the show, will not be surprised that some of the conditions that are required for us to actually go ahead and reach that point are very much tied to the concept of empowerment and autonomy and mastery, being able to do it on your own, and viewing how you progress through time. That is based on some sort of individual freedom with the corresponding responsibility that is tied to what I'm going to call a collective conscience. And then inevitably we'd be talking about intrinsic motivators over extrinsic motivators. The pride of doing something well, the contentment to be found within an area that you have a say and feel that your efforts lead to the overall well-being of where you live. So let's look at this last concept a little bit more in detail. Value being generated by our individual efforts, focusing on a common goal. Well, that works as long as nobody comes in and decides that the opposite goal is actually much more attractive. And really, that's what Hardin describes within the tragedy of the commons. In other words, we only need one individual to come in and say, well, these rules do not belong to me. I am going to follow my own rules. And as long as that individual can get away with it, then this dream remains a dream that's not achievable. And so then the real question is going to be, can we decide what it's worth for us? And to what degree we are willing to defend that? Because the value that we see within that common good far exceeds the effort that would be required for us to actually go ahead and defend it. And I truly believe in looking at what took place in Glasgow and what takes place on various levels within our society requires us to go ahead and pose that question, is it worth it for us? And that could be the issue, that we're not convinced that it's worth it. Or we're not capable of actually recognizing the value Or maybe, just maybe, the real issue is not being able to come up with a better way of managing the free riders. So first off, let me go ahead and describe this concept of free rider, and then we'll spend some time looking at this concept from different perspectives. So a free rider by nature is the individual or the groups that profit from the efforts of others. Now, we could look at this concept on numerous levels, and the idea is not to go into the minutia. But going back to that example I brought across a few minutes ago, where if you feel that you are spending a lot of energy making something happen and bringing value, and the others around you aren't contributing, after a while, you toss that overboard and say, what's the point of going ahead and subsidizing them? And really, we're talking about a system that is clearly broken, right? But in comparison to the usual approach that we take, that being, well, let's go ahead and demonize these individuals. So they're free riders and they should not be doing that. I would argue that not only is it not very practical, that it has no base in reality, because in essence, that free rider concept is both situational and dispositional. In other words, depending upon the situation, if we feel that we can get something for nothing, then I suspect there aren't too many people on this planet who will not go ahead and take advantage of it. And that includes, obviously, yours truly. And then, of course, the concept of free riding. Can we argue that it's dispositional? Well, yeah, certainly if we claim that this mentality is something that's innate in most of us, I would never be so ostentatious to go ahead and make the claim that it belongs to all of us, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say most of us. Then isn't it easier to admit the reality and try to come up with a better model that understands that if indeed we're put in that situation, we'll take advantage of something for nothing, and that's pretty much innate. And if we have models that never allow us to get to that situation, and of course we don't want to forget the concept of free choice. We don't want to forget any of our concepts. Let's go back to the list. The empowerment, that people feel empowered, that a certain amount of freedom is there, and that they take the responsibility for that freedom. That any sound model has to have these two components as part of it. Otherwise, we are looking at some sort of dictatorship, and I will not talk about the current situation and to what degree. Some will actually go ahead and make a claim that that's the current state of affairs in November 2021. So let's stop with the demonization of free riding, and let's see collectively if we can come up with a better way of dealing with it. So first off, if we look at the flip side of getting something for nothing, what would that be? Well, in my mind, it would be a penalty that is accrued by an individual and in fact the penalty is the price, so basically they're not getting it for free anymore. But of course we're talking about collective good, so it's not that easy. So the question would be, can we come up with a model so that everyone feels everyone else's pain? We're talking about some big problems here. And apart from the ecological part that we keep talking about, I'd like to come back to this concept, of course, of equity in the social. And if we look at this concept of the penalty for each individual should be tied to the ability to actually feel the pain of everyone within this construct, the model that we're talking about, either looking at it as being our household or our neighborhood, our community, our city, our region, or inevitably the planet. So what if we were able to come up with a way that we entrust some sort of third party to be the gatekeeper? And within this concept of the third party, they are not to receive any profit from this undertaking. That would be a major prerequisite. So they would be neutral, they would be non-profit, quote unquote. And if each member of the group could actually transfer some sort of funds to this third party, so that we can ensure that we would have some sort of enforcement mechanism. And within this game, let's call it a game, if we all cooperate, then we all get our proceeds at the end. And what if we were to, within this construct, have small payments being made periodically or continuously, even better, so that at the end, all those small payments are given back to everyone who cooperates as a lump sum? Then, of course, there is a clear reward. Almost sounds like the way it used to work with the bank, where you would put in small amounts, and at the end you will see that you will have a larger amount. But that alone would, of course, wouldn't really be enough, because that means that everyone is putting in the same level of effort, and they're all truly profiting at the same level. So you'd need to come up with payments that would be tied to the role of the individual or the organization, and how much they're actually producing. And if we were looking at this model being tied to getting closer to, let's say, 2040, because that's the claim that we keep making here in Austria these days, that we plan to be CO2 neutral by the year 2040. So let's go ahead and put that as our deadline. And we would have everyone within our society, big and small, contributing into this pot. Now let's call it the CO2 pot. Doesn't have to be money. We could look at it as being some other type of collateral. And to keep the momentum, the closer we get to 2040, the more we have to pay. Because we know for a fact that, and this is human nature, the closer we get to the goal, the easier it becomes for specific individuals or groups to defect. Defect meaning that they decided, well, it's not worth it after all. We've already pretty much accomplished the goal, so why do I need to go ahead and contribute in this last spurt? Because the group will do it for us. So within this model, we need to make sure from the get-go that simply doesn't happen. If we were to come up with an example based on something very simple that we all deal with, could you imagine if we were able to come up with a model that allows us to properly disperse energy? Let's call it electricity. It's a little bit easier, simply because not everybody has a car. Not everyone is using electricity at the same level. So in other words, we need to make sure we can better regulate that. But we clearly need to establish some sort of incentive within this construct. So taking the example I just gave, so how would that look? Well, I think the first step would be to establish collectively some sort of goal that we need to save. And by collectively stating that goal, then we would need to understand, well, what is the price? And that price takes on, of course, different levels. Not necessarily from just the monetary side, but the actual inconvenience. And just imagine for a second that within that goal, we've more or less established what is fair. To reach the goal, then that means that everybody needs to have reduced their energy to a certain level. Or conversely, they are allowed to use that much energy. And we've decided that we're concentrating on electricity. So there are going to be all kinds of provisions that will be part of this. Not everyone has 100% electric domiciles. And if we look at the real problem, is that at least a third of the accommodation here in Vienna does not fit that description. And so we would need to take that into consideration. And indeed, we can use a model like this as a way by which we can finance reaching the 100% electric domiciles, or as close to 100% as possible. So the model would actually be regenerative, using the proceeds that are coming from those that actually take more of the electricity, that we use it to make sure that we reach parity. And if somebody can afford it, well, let them. But what about those individuals who do not use their fair share? Shouldn't they get a rebate? So either you are paying a surcharge if you use more than the agreed upon limit, or you get something back. And if you look at a model like that, then who are the free riders? I struggle in identifying one, but I might be wrong, and please feel free to hold me honest on this. But those that can consume more don't just pay whatever the corresponding price would be, but this would be arithmetic, meaning that they would have to pay much more for exceeding whatever we agree is being the benchmark. And then, of course, for those of us who are able to reduce the electricity, or by nature do not use much electricity, we're given an incentive because we get the bonus, we get the rebate. So what if we were able to take a model like this and transpose it onto the efforts that we're making in getting rid of greenhouse gases, or reducing greenhouse gases? Could we take some of these ideas and apply them? Here's my modest attempt. We look at global supply chains. Then you could theoretically say that everyone's a sinner. And in fact, I would argue that what Hardin talks about in The Tragedy of the Commons truly does fall in line. Because we have overuse and underprovision. Everyone's keen to get their fair share, whatever that fair share may be. And nobody's really interested. Nobody's an absolute. Change that, Mike. That most, or many, are not keen on solving the problem of underprovision. Let's go through the supply chain. Put a microscope under it and see where these problems are. So if we look at the extraction of virgin materials, did you know that mining is the third largest use of energy? Third, and I'm sure you're asking the question right now, what is number one and number two? And this changes through time. But it's generally agreed that Bitcoin is number one, and data centers are number two. Mining falls into the third category. So that even if we move towards renewables, we're still going to need mines. And therefore, we are going to need the energy to manage those mines. But of course, the extraction alone is not the sole source of the greenhouse gases. According to the International Maritime Organization's Greenhouse Gas Survey of 2020, shipping contributes almost 3%, 2.89% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So we've taken the virgin material and we've brought it to those that are performing the manufacturing. And of course, we know that within the manufacturing, we have all kinds of greenhouse gas production. We have, of course, the actual production itself, and then, of course, whatever's left over. And then we're back to the transportation again. Where we store those products and where we sell them from. Are they producing any greenhouse gases? I would argue yes. And then, of course, there's always the consumer. Oh, did I forget? What if we produce something that nobody needs or buys or uses on time? And that can be found throughout the entire chain. So I would argue that we're finding all kinds of free riders throughout that entire scenario, the one I just went ahead and described to you. And more importantly, we don't have ways for all of these actors to work together. So here's my idea. I think that will probably be enough for us for today. So that means there's going to be continuation next week, just so you're aware. Do you know how value-added tax works? Value-added tax is a charge that is to be found throughout the entire chain. So in other words, there's a VAT on the extraction, there is a VAT on the transportation in some fashion. The manufacturing also includes a VAT, and it goes all the way down to the consumer. And within this VAT model, they've built it in that so you pay the tax on the one hand, but you get it back through the other hand, except if you're the consumer. And there are some exceptions, but that's pretty much how it works. So could you imagine if we were to take a vehicle like that and use it for a carbon tax? But before we go down that route, we really need to make sure it's quite clear why we're doing this. What are we trying to achieve? So certainly cooperation has to be priority number one. And if you think about going back to Hardin's model with the pasture, if we were to get all the participants to cooperate, then basically you would not have that tragedy of the commons. And we should always be very cognizant of that particular component, that if we were able to come up with ways to foster cooperation, then basically the problem is solved. So we want all the stakeholders to work together to improve the situation tied to, let's concentrate on greenhouse gas. I personally believe that if we get cooperation on one level, it's easy to transpose that cooperation into other levels. But first we have to get it started. And can we go ahead and show that through cooperation it's easier to reach the goals than if we were to try all of this on our own. So we're really talking about coming up with ways to ensure that cooperation takes place. But to make it regenerative means that people have to want to continue to cooperate because they see it's in their best interest. Working together allows us to accomplish much more than we would ever be able to do on our own. And these are basic components here. And of course, we don't want any free riders. So we need to be able to penalize the sinners and reward the saints. And of course, we have another bill that we need to pay, and that is to, and this was quite clear in Glasgow, we need to figure out ways to finance the work that's required in the global south for those who were not able to profit from this profligate attitude that we have and are truly paying the price. So we of course we need to make sure that we reward the stakeholders that are not consuming. So in other words, following the same model that I described with the electricity, if you use less, you get a rebate. So if we can get people to use less, then they should be paid for using less. That needs to be part of the model as well. So I would propose that we have some sort of third party that's responsible, and I'm not quite sure what that third party should be. I'm not quite sure if it's the United Nations. And leave that one quite open, but we need to have some authority that is independent. And the percentage of the greenhouse gases that you're producing is what you pay. And if you are able to reduce that, then basically the tax should be reduced. And within this model, we need to make sure that there's a true reward for stakeholders working together to reduce the CO2 or the greenhouse gas. And that would mean that the figure that of the savings that's actually created would be collective, and all of the stakeholders would pay less. So following the description I gave earlier and making sure that everyone feels everyone else's pain, then the inverse should also be true, that if we can create models where everybody can profit, then the incentive is to work together, because otherwise we do not see the profit. And then I think the last part of that equation would be not just making sure that the customers are involved, that we build in incentives there too, so the less they use, the more they get. But we need to build those penalties in that are not one-to-one, because of course we in the global north will always figure out ways to produce the money to go ahead and pay for it. But we need to be able to feel the pain. And if we don't feel the pain, then we have no incentive to do something or not to do something. So we need to build in additional penalties for the overconsumption, and of course the rewards for the underconsumption. And I would argue that the amount of what's permissible has to be continuously reduced the closer we get to that magic date where we should be able to reach our goals. And that follows the same idea as I mentioned earlier. If the closer we get to the goal, the more we have to pay, then it eliminates the idea of getting free riders that will say, oh, we're almost at 2050, and so the others are basically very busy and working and reaching the goal, so I could take a break right now. And if we think that's not going to happen, then we clearly do not understand human nature. So that's my proposal for today. And I welcome anyone to go ahead and thrash it, because I know for a fact that if nobody can thrash it, then it's probably worth pursuing. So with that, I'd like to thank you and look forward to the continuance of this concept next time we're together. Thanks for listening. Have a good week.